Welcome back to the deep dive, everybody. Today we're diving into a pretty crucial topic, how counselors can really connect with and support clients from all walks of life, different backgrounds. And,
Yeah,
you've sent me some pretty fascinating stuff on this, all about what it means to be truly multiculturally competent, especially as the world gets more and more interconnected.
absolutely. Yeah, it's a big one.
So what we're aiming for today is to go beyond just definitions and really grasp the core elements of what makes a counselor culturally competent. What are the real challenges they face trying to achieve this? And why does all of this even matter so much in today's world?
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to try to go beyond that surface level and really explore the nitty-gritty, the skills, the awareness, the things that allow counselors to provide truly helpful and ethical support, recognizing all those different cultural experiences that are out there. And it's interesting because the material you send actually traces the whole development of this idea, and it's fascinating how it's evolved. It's changed as the world has changed.
Right. Let's start unpacking this a bit. So this whole idea of multicultural counseling competence, where did it even come from? What was the initial spark?
I think it really came from a growing awareness that the traditional ways of doing counseling, the approaches, they were often rooted in a very specific cultural context. And because of that, they weren't always effective for clients from different backgrounds. Sometimes they could even be harmful. So this initial push, it started a few decades back, and it was all about formally identifying what worked and then training counselors in those specific skills. And that's how we got this idea of multicultural counseling competencies. It was really about making sure that the support offered was ethical and helpful for everyone, no matter their background.
Right. And it sounds like early on they identified a few key areas that counselors really needed to focus on. Can you walk us through what those initial core components were?
Yeah, absolutely. The early models really zeroed in on three interconnected dimensions. So first, there was this huge emphasis on the counselor's own awareness, their beliefs, values, biases, and attitudes. This is all about self-understanding, really recognizing how your own cultural journey shapes how you see the world, how you see others.
Makes sense.
The second one was the importance of actually gaining knowledge and understanding of the worldviews of diverse individuals and groups. So it's not just about yourself, but it's actively learning about different cultures, their unique perspective, how they see things.
Yeah.
And then finally, the third component was all about developing and using culturally appropriate intervention skills and strategies, like having the right tools and approaches that are sensitive and effective in different cultural contexts.
Okay, so it's like a journey inward and then outward, right? Understanding yourself so you can better understand others, and then knowing how to act in a way that's actually helpful.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, one of the things that really stood out to me in what you sent over is just how much more diverse the U.S. has become. How has that demographic shift really pushed this idea of multicultural competence even further?
It's a massive point, right? Because the demographic landscape has changed so much. We've seen this huge growth in various populations and this increasing diversity, along with the fact that we're all so globally interconnected now, means multicultural competence can't just be about understanding different groups within the U.S. Counselors really need to see diversity through this global lens.
It's not just about knowing different cultural norms within, one society, but being ready to engage with people who have connections and roots all over the world.
Exactly. And historically, counselor training has often been pretty U.S.-centric. So now, counselors are really faced with this challenge of broadening their understanding beyond just national perspectives if they want to be effective in this globalized world we live in. One of the sources you sent even mentioned that some counselors report feeling less confident navigating multicultural diversity in a global context compared to a domestic one, which makes sense, right? It's a whole other layer.
It's a whole other layer. Okay, this is where it gets really interesting. Let's break down those three dimensions of multicultural counseling competence. The first one, belief and attitude. What's the heart of this dimension? What are we really asking counselors to examine about themselves?
It all boils down to critically examining your values and beliefs, particularly when it comes to people from different racial and ethnic backgrounds. It's about doing the hard work, sometimes uncomfortable work, of uncovering personal biases and stereotypes, and then really trying to cultivate a mindset that genuinely values multiculturalism. And the sources were pretty strong on this. They said that a counselor's unexamined values and biases can be a huge obstacle in building those effective cross-cultural relationships.
It's not enough to just say you're open-minded. You have to really dig deep and identify those unconscious assumptions or prejudices, the things we might all have.
That's it. And according to the sources, culturally skilled counselors really believe that understanding their own cultural heritage and how it shapes their perceptions is super important. They recognize that their background has shaped their attitudes, values, even their biases about what's considered normal behavior, what's abnormal. And they're willing to acknowledge the limits of their own knowledge and expertise. They're comfortable recognizing and addressing any discomfort they feel when they encounter cultural differences. Like, for example, a counselor might need to explore why they feel more comfortable discussing certain topics with clients from similar backgrounds and what that says about their own biases.
Yeah, that kind of self-awareness sounds like a constant practice, not just a one-time thing.
For sure.
Okay, the second dimension is knowledge. What kind of knowledge are we talking about here? What's absolutely crucial for cultural competence?
This dimension really stresses the importance of counselors understanding their own worldview, but just as importantly, acquiring specific knowledge about the cultural groups they're working with. And this goes beyond just knowing about customs and traditions. It's about understanding those bigger socio-political forces that shape the lives and experiences of their diverse clients. Like knowing about historical discrimination or how immigration policies impact a particular community. That kind of context is crucial.
It's not just knowing about cultural holidays or celebrations, it's understanding the real lived realities of people and the systemic factors that play a role in their lives.
Exactly. And culturally skilled counselors, they really try to gain specific knowledge about their own racial and cultural heritage and how that influences their basic definitions of well-being and even the entire counseling process. They also need to understand the impact of things like oppression, racism, discrimination, and stereotyping, how those things affect society as a whole and their clients individually. And then understanding differences in communication styles, both verbal and nonverbal, and how those differences can affect the counseling relationship. That's really vital. I mean, even something like direct eye contact, that could be seen as respectful in one culture, but confrontational in another.
Right, right. And one of the sources talked about this developmental process for how counselors actually acquire cultural knowledge. It seems like a really interesting way to think about it. Can you explain a little more about what that involves?
Yeah, it draws on those models of intellectual development and basically suggests that gaining cultural knowledge is a journey. You know, it might start at a stage where you're less aware of cultural nuances, maybe relying more on generalizations or even stereotypes. As you progress, you start actively seeking out factual information about different cultures. And then there's a deeper engagement with the complexities of cultural identity and how to integrate that understanding into your own perspective. The goal is to reach this stage of critical self-reflection, where you have a really nuanced understanding of how culture shapes you and your clients. And that allows for a more effective and empathetic approach. But it's not a straight line. Counselors might find themselves at different stages depending on the specific cultural group they're working with.
So it highlights that becoming culturally knowledgeable isn't just about, reading a book. It's this active process of learning and growth. It's a journey.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, let's move on to the third dimension, skill. So how does a counselor actually take all that awareness and knowledge and turn it into action? How do they use it?
This is where the rubber meets the road, right? The skill dimension. It's about actually applying all that awareness and knowledge you've worked on. Being able to choose and use intervention techniques and strategies that are appropriate and effective when working with clients from different backgrounds. And this dimension, it really depends on the foundation laid by the first two.
So if a counselor's done the work to understand their own biases and they've learned about their client's worldview, they then need to be able to adapt their counseling approach to fit that specific client.
Exactly. This means the counselor is super aware of their own assumptions, values, and biases. They deeply understand the worldview of their culturally different client, and then, crucially, they can develop and skillfully use appropriate intervention strategies and techniques. And culturally skilled counselors, they're always looking for ways to grow. They seek out educational opportunities, they consult with colleagues who have different expertise, and they take part in training to continuously refine their skills and also to recognize where their competence might be limited. They're committed to this ongoing process of understanding themselves as racial and cultural beings, always striving to develop a non-racist identity, which informs their whole practice.
It's a constant process of learning and adapting. Okay, moving on to the next important area, counselor awareness of clients' worldview. We've touched on this a little, but what are some really specific things a counselor needs to be tuned into to really get their client's perspective?
The sources really highlight that culturally skilled counselors are very aware of their own emotional reactions, both positive and negative, toward people from different backgrounds. And they know that if they don't examine those reactions, they could unintentionally harm the counseling relationship, which is so important. They also need to be genuinely open to comparing their own belief systems with those of their clients in a non-judgmental way. And fundamentally, they have to be constantly aware of their own stereotypes and any preconceived notions they might hold, and actively work to challenge those assumptions. So for example, a counselor needs to be aware if they're making assumptions about a client's family structure based on their cultural background instead of the client's actual experience.
Right, so it's this ongoing self-monitoring and a real commitment to empathy, putting yourself in their shoes.
Yeah.
What about the knowledge part of understanding a client's worldview?
So knowledge in this context means having specific information about the client's life, their cultural heritage, and their historical background. It also includes understanding how things like race, culture, and ethnicity can influence a whole range of things, from personality development and career choices to how psychological distress might show up, how someone feels about seeking help, even whether certain counseling approaches will be a good fit.
And the skills, how does a counselor demonstrate this deep understanding of the client's worldview and how they practice?
Skills in this area involve actively staying up to date on the latest research about mental health and psychological challenges within different ethnic and racial groups. But it goes beyond just academics. It also means actively seeking out chances to engage with people from diverse backgrounds outside of the therapy room. That kind of direct engagement provides insights and a richness of understanding that you just can't get from books or articles. Things like going to community events or having conversations with people from different backgrounds can really enhance a counselor's understanding.
That makes a lot of sense. It's about bridging the gap between what you know in theory and what you understand from real-world experience.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to culturally appropriate intervention strategies. What are some core beliefs and attitudes that guide a counselor in this area?
So the sources emphasize how important it is to respect clients' diverse religious and spiritual beliefs and practices, including their own ways of understanding their problems and any cultural taboos that might be relevant. Culturally skilled counselors also value indigenous helping practices and the support systems that exist within different communities, and they value multilingualism. They don't see a client's use of a different language as a barrier to communication. They're open to working with interpreters and understanding all those nuances that come with communicating across languages.
And in terms of knowledge, what does a counselor need to know to develop and use these culturally appropriate interventions?
Counselors need to understand that traditional counseling and therapy often operate within a specific cultural framework, and that might not align with the values and experiences of all clients. They should be aware of the barriers that prevent people from marginalized groups from accessing mental health services. And it's super important to understand potential biases and assessment tools, and to consider a client's cultural and linguistic background when interpreting those results. They also need to understand the diversity of family structures, values, and beliefs across cultures, be aware of community resources that might be culturally specific, and understand the impact of ongoing discrimination at both the social and community level.
It seems like you need this really comprehensive understanding of both the client's inner world and their broader social context.
Yeah, absolutely.
What about the skills involved in actually using these culturally appropriate interventions?
This is where it gets really practical. Culturally skilled counselors are flexible and adaptable in their approach. They're good at using a wide range of verbal and nonverbal communication techniques, and they're skilled at sending and interpreting messages across cultural differences. They're not stuck on one specific therapy model. They can modify their approach if they see it's not working or could even be harmful to a client. They're also ready to advocate for their clients within systems that might not be culturally sensitive. And they help clients analyze whether their challenges are coming from those systemic issues rather than just internal factors. They should be open to collaborating with traditional healers or religious leaders in the client's community when it's appropriate, and they should be prepared to communicate in the client's language or make referrals to those who can. They also need expertise in using traditional assessment tools while being very aware of their cultural limitations. And finally, they actively work to eliminate biases in their evaluations and interventions, and they take the time to explain the counseling process to clients in a way that's culturally sensitive.
It really highlights that becoming culturally competent is not just something that happens passively, it's an active process.
It is.
The last section you sent me talks about the ongoing development of cultural competence. It seems like this is a constant journey of learning and refining your approach.
Absolutely. The sources emphasize that this isn't a finish line you cross. It's an ongoing process that requires constant learning and self-reflection. And Research suggests that while initial multicultural training can definitely boost a counselor's awareness and knowledge, there are questions about how well that knowledge actually translates into practice with clients.
So just knowing about different cultures doesn't automatically mean you can effectively support someone from that background in a counseling setting.
Exactly. The idea is that multicultural training needs to go beyond just giving information, what some call surface-level understanding, and really help counselors change how they see the world and their clients. Self-reflection is super crucial for developing true cultural competence. It allows counselors to look closely at their own assumptions, beliefs, and biases, which are often unconscious. This ongoing self-reflection, combined with having meaningful conversations with people from diverse backgrounds and staying open to new experiences, are all seen as key for challenging those cultural biases and ethnocentric assumptions that can get in the way of effective counseling.
So it's this cycle of learning, reflecting, and being willing to change your own perspective as you learn more.
Exactly. This journey toward cultural competence, it demands that you constantly examine yourself and be willing to confront your own potential biases. It's about developing the ability to see things from multiple cultural perspectives and using critical thinking to choose the most effective and culturally sensitive approaches to care.
Okay, let's bring it all together. What are the main takeaways you want listeners to remember from this deep dive into multicultural counseling competence?
We've explored how complex and always evolving this type of competence is. And we've really focused on the interaction between a counselor's self-awareness, their understanding of different worldviews, and their ability to use culturally appropriate interventions. You should have a clearer picture now of how much depth and commitment it takes to become a truly culturally skilled counselor, especially in our world that's so diverse and interconnected.
And that leads us to our final thought for you to chew on. Given how deeply ingrained our cultural perspectives and assumptions can be, how can we as individuals and as a society move beyond simply acknowledging diversity and actually start dismantling systemic barriers? How do we truly create genuine inclusivity in all parts of our lives, not just in counseling? This feels like a constant process of learning, reflecting, and taking action that goes way beyond any single conversation or setting.
Absolutely, yeah. It's something we all need to keep working on.
Thanks for listening, everyone, and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.